Okay, so one thing that I want to discuss is the differences between regular variables and variables that are sometimes what we call static. I like to think of them as global variables, variables that don't terminate when a oops, wrong one. When a method stops. Okay, so here we have button one click. Button one click is a method, but when we get from this brace all the way down to this brace down here, where you're seeing my little window thing pop up, that's the entire method. Okay, and when it hits this closing brace, everything inside here basically goes away. All of the data that's inside of here goes away. However, I have some variables up here which don't go away, even though they're visible to button one click. They don't go away because they are static. They exist outside of button one click. They are not part of button one click. They are accessible, available to button one click, but they are not part of button one click. I tend to think of them as global variables. That is, they are available to any and all methods within. Okay, they're available to button one click, but they're also available to button two click. Okay, so the handout talks about different types of variables in terms of what they can store, so I won't go over that too much. But the variables that are outside of these, which I've got marked here as static, these are available in either place. So if I run this program, you'll see that there's two buttons on this form. If I put a value in here, this value is only available to button one click. Okay, so if I click on button one, I get hello, I get 12. Those were the two static variables, but I also get the number that I put in down here, which is only part of button one click. So if I put in this thing which says show the static variables only, you see that those are available to both of these, but this number here that I put in was only part of button one. Okay, this number was one that was part of button two, this button over here, but it wasn't a part of button one. Okay, so 25 only a part of button one. This one, which internally is basically named button two, but only has access to this 13 plus the global static variables of hello and 12. Now I know that's probably a little confusing, but I'm trying to see if I can get all of this on screen at the same time. Doesn't look like it. We'll see. Let's see. The numbers for 13 are down here below this. Let's see if I can widen that a little bit. Okay, so this is the thing that comes up with 13. I have a number 1 and a number 12. They add together and then are output. But that's in the button 2 click section. These are in the button 1 click section. And again, you can see this here. I said show the static variables. And again, this shows up here. Show the static variables. But this one is not the static variable. This was in this particular section, and these two are in this particular section, but they're not static variables. The only variables which are static are up here where it says hello and 12, and they're marked in a comment here that says static. These are static variables. The handout, I don't know whether I've edited enough, but strings are not the only static variables, and to say that they are is woefully inadequate. I've been programming, gosh, how many decades has it been now? I don't know. Anyway, actually, I've been programming professionally for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 decades, something like that. And then for another decade before that. So, when I was a kid. So, you can take my word for it. Static is one thing. Immutability, which you might see talked about when you see strings, especially from Microsoft, immutability is a completely separate thing. So the assignment actually talks about printing out static variables. Excuse me. Static variables. Static variables are different from immutability, and immutability is not really entirely accurate either. Immutability implies that there's nothing at all that can change a particular variable. Strings have a tendency to be, strings are declared differently than are numbers. So let me put it this way. When you declare numbers, numbers are usually declared within a given method, okay, method or function. And I say usually because if you look up here, I've got a number declared outside of the function, outside of the method. But so it's not impossible to declare a number outside of the method or function, whatever you want to call it. But it's kind of rare to do it. And the reason for that is that if I start a method or a function in C# especially, when this gets to the end, when this gets to the closing brace, all of these variables that are declared are emptied. They're completely taken away, removed from memory. That's a process which we call garbage collection. It's not, it's kind of a funny term, but that's what it's called. It's called garbage collection. And it's usually done to save memory. Now, we usually have lots of memory today, but back when computers were in their infancy, for especially for home computers, when people had computers that had 32 kilobytes or less of RAM, and we loaded programs into memory, we didn't want them using up all of memory while trying to write programs or to run programs. So when a function was in memory, it was given space, but as soon as that function was done, we usually had some process by which to collapse the excess variables in on themselves so that they weren't used anymore. In week 3, we'll talk about stacks and queues, but stacks especially, we have to understand when you go into a function or a method for the first time, the variables that get declared, those variables that are being declared are declared on the method stack. They are created there, and then when it gets to the closing brace, that stack, all of those variables are popped off and the stack is collapsed in order to save memory. That process of popping off those variables and collapsing that method is called garbage collection. And C# does this automatically at the end of any particular method, any particular function. However, when you have static variables, those persist until the end of the program, till the end of the project. Okay? When you reach the end of the project, the static variables are then popped off of the program stack, the project stack, and then the entire program goes through the remaining garbage collection, and that's the end of that. Now, it's also possible to declare a variable inside of a method or function as static so that when everything else is being collapsed out of the method or function, that one will stick. Essentially, it's made into one of these type of static variables. But it's not a good idea to do that unless you absolutely have to. Okay, so I think this is pretty much the end of this. Definitely read the handout, and if you have questions, make sure to ask questions.